You've felt it before. That weight in your chest when you want something you're told you shouldn't want. That voice whispering you're fundamentally flawed. That sensation of being watched, judged, found wanting by invisible eyes. Most people assume this guilt is natural, perhaps even divine. But what if it's neither? What if the feeling of sin itself was reverse-engineered into human consciousness? There's a peculiar phenomenon happening in psychological clinics across developed nations. Therapists report patients experiencing what they call non-specific guilt, a pervasive sense of wrongness without clear origin or rational basis. These aren't people who've committed crimes or harmed others. They're ordinary individuals haunted by shame they can't explain. When pressed to identify the source, they struggle. The guilt just exists, ambient and constant, like background radiation. This isn't random. This isn't natural. And one philosopher recognized it as the most sophisticated control mechanism ever deployed against the human mind. He didn't just observe it. He traced its engineering back through centuries, identifying the precise moment when guilt transformed from occasional emotion into permanent psychological infrastructure. What he discovered wasn't theology. It was technology, social technology, designed to make people police themselves. The question isn't whether you feel guilty. The question is whether that guilt serves you or something else entirely. Because once you understand how the machinery of sin was installed, you start noticing the gears everywhere, in the way you hesitate before pleasure, in the way you apologize for existing, in the way you've been taught to perceive your own nature as something requiring constant correction and control. Someone built this system. Someone benefits from it, and recognizing the architecture is the first step toward dismantling it. Can you afford to ignore how deeply your sense of self has been shaped by mechanisms you never consented to? Here's what doesn't make sense about sin as we've inherited it. The concept appears remarkably late in human religious development. Early sacred texts from various cultures acknowledge harmful actions, yes, but they don't contain this peculiar idea of inherent wrongness that precedes any action. Ancient Greek religion had hubris and offense against gods, but not this totalizing sense of being fundamentally corrupt. Early Judaism focused on covenant violations, breaking specific agreements, not on ontological stain. Buddhism identified suffering caused by attachment, not moral pollution of the soul itself. Then something shifted. By the time Christianity consolidated power in Rome, a new framework had emerged. Suddenly humans weren't just capable of wrong actions, they were wrong in their essence, born wrong, existing wrong. Augustine of Hippo formalized this in the 4th and 5th centuries with his doctrine of original sin, the idea that guilt is inherited, transmitted biologically, present before the first conscious thought or deliberate choice. You don't commit sin and become guilty. You're guilty and therefore inevitably commit sin. The sequence matters enormously. This represented a profound innovation in social control. Previous systems required catching people doing something wrong. This new system declared everyone already wrong, always wrong, wrong by default. It created a permanent spiritual debt that could never be fully repaid. And here's the revealing part. This framework exploded precisely when Christianity was transitioning from persecuted sect to imperial religion. The timing isn't coincidental. When a religion gains institutional power, it requires different tools. Martyrdom works for minorities seeking authenticity, but empires need subjects who govern themselves, who internalize control so thoroughly that external force becomes unnecessary. The machinery spread with remarkable efficiency. Medieval Christianity developed an entire economy around guilt management. Indulgences, confessions, penances, elaborate hierarchies of sin with corresponding punishments. The Church didn't just forgive sins, it defined them, categorized them, maintained the only authorized channels for their resolution. It's a perfect closed system. Create the disease, monopolize the cure, ensure the disease can never be permanently cured. What does it mean that the concept of sin became most sophisticated exactly when it became most profitable, most politically useful, most effective at ensuring compliance without visible coercion? Friedrich Nietzsche encountered this machinery personally before he understood it philosophically. Raised in a devout Lutheran household in Röcken, Germany, he was surrounded by the apparatus of sin from birth. His father was a pastor. His childhood home was saturated with the language of unworthiness, divine judgment, and necessary submission. As a young boy, he was considered extraordinarily pious. His classmates called him the little Jesus, because of his serious devotion. He internalized the guilt framework completely, assuming his constant sense of inadequacy reflected accurate self-perception rather than installed programming. But Nietzsche possessed an unusual capacity for noticing contradictions. As he studied theology and philology at university, he began examining Christian texts with the same analytical tools used for any historical document. He started asking uncomfortable questions. Why did this particular version of guilt emerge when it did? What functions did it serve? Who benefited from populations believing themselves fundamentally corrupt? The questions themselves felt transgressive, not because they were intellectually weak, but because they were forbidden. And that prohibition itself became evidence. The turning point came through his study of ancient Greek culture. Here was a sophisticated civilization that produced extraordinary philosophy, art, and political thought. Without this framework of ontological guilt, the Greeks understood that actions had consequences. They recognized that excessive pride invited disaster, but they didn't carry this pervasive sense of being cosmically wrong in their existence. Nietzsche realized he was looking at a control variable, same human nature, different moral architecture, radically different outcomes in terms of creative vitality and psychological freedom. He began his investigation in the 1870s and 1880s, particularly in works like On the Genealogy of Morals and The Antichrist. But this wasn't detached academic analysis. Nietzsche was trying to understand his own chains. He was mapping the machinery of guilt because he could feel it operating in his own psychology, limiting what he allowed himself to think, feel, and become. His philosophy emerged from direct confrontation with the control system he'd inherited. What he discovered wasn't just historical curiosity. It was the blueprint of psychological domestication, refined across centuries, operating invisibly in millions of minds, including his own. He was conducting forensic analysis on his own consciousness, and what he found there was architecture that had been deliberately installed. The investigation that followed would expose not just religious history, but the mechanics of how human beings are trained to fear their own nature. Nietzsche's first breakthrough came from linguistic analysis. He noticed something peculiar about how moral language evolved across Indo-European cultures. The earliest moral terms didn't reference good and evil in the way we understand them. They referenced noble and common, strong and weak, beautiful and ugly. These were descriptive categories, not cosmic judgments. A noble action was one characteristic of the aristocratic class, courageous, generous, powerful. A common action was one characteristic of the laboring class, cautious, resentful, calculating. No inherent morality attached, just observation of behavioral patterns in different social positions. But somewhere in the evolution of Jewish and early Christian thought, this linguistic framework inverted completely. What had been called noble became evil. What had been called common became good. Strength became sin. Pride became the deadliest transgression. Meekness became virtue. Suffering became holy. This wasn't gradual drift. It was systematic reversal, and Nietzsche found the mechanism. He called it slave morality, a moral framework invented by the powerless to condemn the powerful, to transform their own weakness into virtue and others' strength into vice. The evidence appeared in Christian texts themselves. The Beatitudes in Matthew's Gospel make it explicit. Blessed are the poor, the meek, those who mourn, those who are persecuted. Not blessed are those who overcome poverty, who develop strength, who transform mourning into creation, who rise above persecution. The formula celebrates victimhood as spiritual achievement. It reframes powerlessness as moral superiority. And here's where Nietzsche identified the genius of the system. Once you convince people that their suffering is virtuous, they'll not only accept it, but defend it. They'll police themselves and others to maintain the conditions of their oppression. They'll call liberation sin and call their chains salvation. Nietzsche found documentation of this process in early church fathers. Tertullian in the 2nd century wrote explicitly about how Christians would enjoy watching their persecutors burn in hell. Lactantius in the 3rd century described divine justice as the spectacle of the powerful suffering eternal torment, while the weak enjoy eternal vindication. This wasn't incidental rhetoric. It was the core psychological operation. Transform resentment into theology. Make revenge sacred. Train people to find satisfaction not in improving their conditions, but in imagining cosmic retribution against those with better conditions. The entire moral framework rests on converting impotence into virtue. How convenient for those managing populations. How devastating for those trying to build actual power and freedom in their lives. Nietzsche pushed deeper into the historical record and found the transmission mechanism. Christianity didn't simply teach this inverted morality, it institutionalized it through a specific technology, confession. The practice emerged gradually in early Christianity, but became mandatory church law by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Every Christian had to confess sins to a priest at least once yearly. Think about what this created. A systematic audit of conscience where individuals were required to inventory their thoughts, desires, and actions against an ever-expanding catalog of prohibited behaviors. But confession did something more insidious than just identifying sins. It trained people to constantly monitor themselves for sinfulness. Between confessions, believers had to track their transgressions, categorize them, prepare to articulate them to authority. This meant living in a state of continuous self-surveillance. Your own mind became an agent of church control, constantly evaluating whether your thoughts and impulses aligned with approved patterns. You became your own inquisitor, and the church just had to periodically collect the reports. The system created what we'd now call a panopticon of the soul. Jeremy Bentham wouldn't propose his famous prison design until the late 18th century, but medieval Christianity had already built the psychological version. The genius of Bentham's panopticon was that prisoners couldn't tell if they were being watched, so they had to assume constant surveillance and behave accordingly. Confession worked identically. God sees everything, knows everything, judges everything. Even if no human witness exists, the divine witness is always present. So you must police your own thoughts as if constantly observed, because in the theology, you are constantly observed. Nietzsche documented how this technology expanded over centuries. The list of sins grew longer and more detailed. Sexual thoughts became sins. Doubt became sin. Pride in achievement became sin. Anger at injustice became sin. The system pathologized normal human psychology, desire, ambition, skepticism, self-assertion, and reclassified these natural impulses as moral failures requiring correction. It's revealing that as the church's temporal power grew, the catalog of sins expanded proportionally. More power meant more things to prohibit, more behaviors to control, more internal experiences to regulate. By the High Middle Ages, Christianity had constructed complete psychological architecture for self-domestication. You didn't need external force when you'd trained people to apply force to themselves. You didn't need visible chains when invisible ones wrapped around every thought and desire. The system was elegant, efficient, and nearly invisible to those operating inside it. They experienced the restrictions as moral truth, divine will, cosmic law, not as human-made control mechanisms serving institutional interests. What does it mean that the religion grew most powerful precisely when it perfected technologies for making power invisible? The pattern Nietzsche uncovered becomes undeniable when you examine who gets labeled sinful and when. The categories aren't random or divinely ordained. They're strategically targeted at behaviors that threaten institutional control. Sexual pleasure outside church-sanctioned marriage. Sin, accumulating wealth without tithing to the church. Sin, questioning church doctrine. Sin, reading unauthorized texts. Sin, claiming direct access to the divine without priestly mediation. Heresy, the ultimate sin. Notice what's being protected. The church's control over reproduction through marriage, its economic base through mandatory contributions, its ideological monopoly through censorship, its position as necessary intermediary between humans and God. Compare this to what doesn't get classified as sin or gets downplayed. Economic exploitation. Jesus said, "Render unto Caesar." Don't resist evil. Turn the other cheek. Slavery. Paul told slaves to obey their masters as they would obey Christ. Colonial violence. Doctrine of discovery declared indigenous lands free for Christian claiming. Wars of conquest. Crusades earned indulgences. Holy wars cleansed sins. The pattern is unmistakable. Sin means resisting church authority or escaping church control, but accepting oppression, maintaining hierarchies, serving power. These range from neutral to virtuous, depending on whether they serve institutional interests. Nietzsche found the formula explicit in Luther's writings, 5 centuries after medieval Catholicism. Luther preached absolute submission to secular authority while railing against church corruption. But his target wasn't authority itself. It was Catholic authority specifically. He wanted to transfer spiritual power from Rome to local princes and religious leaders who supported his movement. His theology of justification, by faith alone, sounds liberating until you realize it makes moral action irrelevant. Faith alone saves you. Works don't matter. So if you're a peasant suffering under brutal lords, Luther literally wrote in his response to the peasants' revolt of 1525 that you should accept your suffering as God's will and focus on inner faith while maintaining outer obedience. Don't try to change conditions. Don't resist oppression. Your earthly situation is spiritually irrelevant. He called rebelling peasants agents of Satan and endorsed their massacre. The pattern holds. Resist power, sin. Accept power, virtue. This is the revealing structure. Sin isn't about objective harm. It's about system maintenance. The behaviors labeled sinful are those that allow people to escape control, build independent power, or challenge institutional authority. The behaviors encouraged or excused are those that maintain hierarchies, ensure obedience, and preserve existing power structures. Once you see this pattern, you can't unsee it. Every moral prohibition starts looking less like divine commandment and more like social engineering. Every call to humility, submission, and self-denial starts sounding less like spiritual wisdom and more like control system propaganda. The question becomes impossible to avoid. If sin was designed to serve power rather than truth, what happens when you stop accepting the framework entirely? The implications of Nietzsche's discovery extend far beyond historical curiosity. If the concept of sin was engineered to domesticate human psychology, then millions of people are carrying shame that serves someone else's agenda. That guilt you feel for wanting more from life, installed. That sense that pleasure is inherently suspicious, programmed. That voice telling you you're fundamentally flawed and need external salvation, not divine revelation. Social conditioning masquerading as cosmic truth. Consider what this means practically. How many people have suppressed their creativity because they learned to see ambition as pride and pride as sin? How many have remained in exploitative situations because they were taught that suffering is virtuous and resistance is selfish? How many have denied their own desires, doubted their own perceptions, and diminished their own power because they internalized a moral framework designed to make them easier to control? The human cost is incalculable. We're talking about generations of people who never discovered what they could become because they were trained to fear their own potential. The psychological mechanism is particularly destructive. Sin-based morality doesn't just prohibit behaviors, it pathologizes desire itself. You're not just doing wrong, you're being wrong by wanting to do wrong. The guilt attaches to your nature, not just your actions. This creates a permanent state of internal conflict. Your natural impulses for pleasure, power, freedom, self-expression, constantly war against your internalized moral prohibitions. You become divided against yourself. Part of you wants life. Part of you has learned to call wanting life sinful. The exhaustion of this constant internal warfare is itself a form of control. People too busy fighting themselves don't have energy to fight external oppression. Nietzsche recognized this internal division as the core wound of Christian psychology. He called it bad conscience, the turning of aggressive instincts inward against the self when they can't be expressed outward. When you can't dominate your environment, you dominate yourself. When you can't exercise power in the world, you exercise it on your own impulses. This produces what he identified as the psychological type, most useful to authority. The person who's strong enough to exert control, but trained to exert it only on themselves, never on their circumstances. Self-disciplined, self-denying, self-policing. The perfect subject for any system requiring compliant populations. The framework also creates dependency on the same institution that installed it. Once you accept that you're fundamentally sinful, you need someone to manage your sin. The church positions itself as the exclusive provider of absolution, the only authorized channel for redemption. It creates the problem and sells the solution, ensuring perpetual need for its services. Modern versions of this pattern appear everywhere. Consumer culture creates insecurity and sells beauty products. Pharmaceutical companies pathologize normal emotional ranges and sell medications. Self-help industries convince people they're broken and sell fixes. The template is old. What happens when you recognize that the sense of needing external salvation might itself be the deepest programming? Here's where Nietzsche's investigation becomes genuinely unsettling. The sin framework didn't just emerge organically or accidentally. Its development was strategic, calculated, refined across centuries by people who understood exactly what they were building. Augustine didn't stumble into the doctrine of original sin. He systematized it deliberately while consolidating church authority. The Council of Trent in the 16th century didn't randomly emphasize human depravity. It weaponized guilt as counter-reformation strategy against Protestant challenges to church power. The pattern suggests coordination, not coincidence. Look at how the framework evolved in response to threats. When Christianity was a minority religion competing for converts, its message emphasized love, community, and equality. Neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, all are one in Christ Jesus. But once Christianity became the Roman state religion under Constantine in the 4th century, the emphasis shifted dramatically toward hierarchy, obedience, and submission to authority. The same texts remained, but interpretation transformed. Suddenly, the important passages were about rendering unto Caesar, slaves obeying masters, wives submitting to husbands, and everyone submitting to church authority as God's representative on earth. This wasn't subtle theological drift. It was systematic re-engineering of the religion's social function. As persecuted minority, emphasize solidarity and resistance to unjust power. As state religion, emphasize obedience and acceptance of existing power. The theological framework that supported this transition was the increasingly elaborate doctrine of sin. The more you emphasized human depravity, the more you justified authoritarian control as necessary to manage humanity's evil nature. The logic is circular but effective. People are inherently sinful, therefore they need strong authority to restrain their wickedness. How do we know they're inherently sinful? Because authority says so, and questioning authority is itself evidence of sinful pride. Nietzsche found evidence that religious leaders explicitly understood this mechanism. Machiavelli wrote candidly in The Prince about how rulers should appear religious to maintain control, while privately treating religion as useful fiction. Gibbon documented in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire how Roman authorities regarded all religions as equally false, but equally useful for social control. The pattern suggests that sophisticated political operators have always understood religion's control function, regardless of personal belief. They maintain the framework because it works, because it makes populations manageable, because it converts potential rebellion into self-directed guilt. The truly disturbing implication is that the system self-perpetuates even without conscious conspiracy. Once the guilt framework is installed in childhood, most people internalize it completely. They don't need external enforcement. They enforce it on themselves and teach it to their children, who teach it to their children. The machinery of control becomes invisible because it operates through sincere belief. The most effective agents of the system genuinely think they're saving souls, spreading truth, serving God, when functionally they're maintaining social control mechanisms that benefit existing power structures. The question isn't whether conscious conspiracy exists at every level, it's whether it matters. If the result is the same, domesticated, self-policing populations, does it matter whether every individual operator understands the system's function? The question becomes, if Nietzsche exposed this machinery over a century ago, why doesn't everyone know? Why isn't this taught in schools, discussed openly, recognized as foundational to understanding how social control operates? The answer reveals how deeply the system protects itself. Nietzsche's work was immediately controversial, and not by accident. Questioning the moral framework that justifies existing power structures is inherently threatening to those structures. The response was swift and comprehensive. Christian institutions denounced his work as dangerous nihilism. Academic philosophy departments, many still dominated by religious thinkers, dismissed him as polemical rather than rigorous. His writing style, aphoristic, dramatic, sometimes deliberately provocative, made it easy to misrepresent his ideas. Critics focused on out-of-context quotes, while ignoring his systematic analysis. The most effective strategy was simply to ignore the substance of his critique and attack his character, his mental health, his supposed bitterness, anything to avoid engaging with the actual evidence he'd assembled about how guilt functions as social control. Then there's the problem of reception. Nietzsche's ideas are inherently difficult for people raised inside the sin framework to process. When you've internalized guilt as moral truth, as divine revelation, as the structure of reality itself, someone pointing out that it's human-made technology sounds not just wrong, but insane. The programming defends itself. Doubt about the framework triggers the framework's own defenses. Guilt about questioning, fear of punishment for skepticism, sense that the doubt itself proves your sinfulness. It's a closed loop that's psychologically difficult to escape, even when presented with evidence. Modern resistance to these ideas follows predictable patterns. When you point out how religious guilt functions as social control, believers respond that you're attacking their faith, their community, their meaning system. They're not entirely wrong. Understanding that moral frameworks serve power interests does destabilize belief systems built on those frameworks. But the response reveals the mechanism. The system trains people to experience criticism of the system as personal attack, as spiritual danger, as evidence of the critic's corruption. This inoculates against analysis. Any investigation of the control mechanism gets coded as the thing the control mechanism warns against: sinful pride, dangerous skepticism, demonic deception. The institutional response has been to quarantine Nietzsche's ideas in academic philosophy, where they can be discussed abstractly without threatening popular belief systems. You can write dissertations about his critique of morality without most people ever encountering the practical implications for their own guilt and shame. The ideas get neutered through academization. Meanwhile, the guilt machinery continues operating in churches, in families, in internalized self-talk, largely invisible to those it controls because they've learned to experience its operation as their own authentic moral intuitions. The system persists, not through active suppression of criticism, but through making the criticism psychologically inaccessible to those who need it most. How do you receive information that your moral intuitions are programmed when your programmed moral intuitions tell you such information is dangerous? The final question isn't whether sin was invented. The evidence Nietzsche assembled makes that clear enough. The final question is what you do with that knowledge, because recognizing that guilt was installed doesn't automatically remove it. The programming runs deep. You can intellectually understand that your shame serves control mechanisms and still feel the shame. You can trace the historical origins of sin-based morality and still hear that voice telling you you're fundamentally flawed. Awareness is necessary but not sufficient for liberation. What Nietzsche proposed was radical revaluation, not replacing Christian morality with another external moral system, but developing what he called life-affirming values based on your actual nature, your actual circumstances, your actual goals. Instead of asking whether something is sinful, ask whether it enhances or diminishes your power, your creativity, your vitality. Instead of seeking permission from inherited moral frameworks, take responsibility for creating your own values. This isn't nihilism, it's the opposite. It's treating moral questions seriously enough to engage with them directly, rather than outsourcing them to ancient authorities. The practical path starts with noticing when guilt appears, not immediately acting on it, or immediately dismissing it, but observing it. Where does this feeling come from? What does it want me to do or not do? Who benefits if I obey this feeling? These questions begin dismantling the machinery by making it visible. The guilt loses power when you recognize it as installed rather than innate, as serving external agendas rather than your authentic well-being. You start distinguishing between guilt that reflects genuine harm you've caused, which calls for repair and changed behavior, and guilt that merely signals deviation from control mechanisms you never consented to. This investigation isn't comfortable. Questioning your inherited moral framework feels dangerous because it was designed to feel dangerous. The programming includes defenses against its own examination, but the alternative is living your entire life in service to values that were engineered to make you manageable, controllable, domesticated. The question is whether you want to discover what you actually value underneath the installed programming, whether you're willing to face the discomfort of uncertainty in exchange for the possibility of authentic values based on your actual nature and circumstances. The invitation isn't to become immoral. It's to become responsible for your morality rather than passively receiving it from authorities whose interests may not align with yours. Nietzsche didn't free himself from Christian guilt to become a monster. He freed himself to ask deeper questions about what makes life meaningful, what creates genuine human flourishing, what values actually serve human potential rather than merely maintaining social control. The answers he found were his answers. Yours will be different, but you won't find them while still operating inside frameworks designed to prevent exactly this kind of questioning. The chains of guilt were installed deliberately. Removing them is also a choice, one you have to make consciously and repeatedly. until the programming finally loosens its hold. Are you ready to question what you've been taught to accept without question?